The day started like any other on my farm in rural Virginia. I woke early, just as the sun was rising over the rolling fields, the air still carrying the cool dampness of morning. Life here was peaceful, grounded, and beautifully ordinary, at least it used to be. I had left Washington, D.C., behind to enjoy quiet weekends tending crops, feeding animals, and reminding myself why I loved the simplicity of land and hard work. Few people knew that when I wasn't on my tractor or wearing muddy boots, I was sitting in one of the most powerful seats in the country, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation. I kept that fact hidden in this small community, preferring to blend in rather than stand out. Unfortunately, that illusion was about to shatter in the most outrageous way possible. For weeks, I had been hearing rumors about the local HOA, the homeowners association that governed the new development a mile down the road. Unlike my farm, which had been in my family for generations, the HOA neighborhood was only a few years old, a cluster of cookie-cutter houses built on what used to be pasture land. I had no direct dealings with them until one morning I stepped outside and noticed something strange. Surveyor flags dotting the edge of my fields, marking lines that had no business being there. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Surveyors often misplaced markers, confusing property boundaries. But then the heavy equipment rolled in. Bulldozers and graders cut through the land like it belonged to them, tearing up fertile soil I had spent decades cultivating. I rushed to confront the workers, demanding to know who had authorized them to tear up my farm. One of them, a young man with a hard hat and a clipboard, told me casually, "We're expanding the HOA's community runway." Board approved it. I blinked, stunned. Runway? What runway? He gestured toward the distance. I followed his finger to see a strip of freshly paved asphalt running straight through my soybean field. It wasn't a road. It was an airstrip, complete with painted markers and lighting poles being installed along the sides. My heart pounded in disbelief. These people hadn't just crossed a property line. They had built an entire runway through my farm, without permission, without consultation, without even a shred of legality. I stormed over to the HOA president's office that same afternoon. The man, a smug middle-aged fellow named Carl Benson, sat behind his desk as though he owned the world. His polo shirt was neatly tucked into khakis, and he had the kind of permanent smirk that screamed entitlement. "Mr. Benson," I began, barely able to control my anger. "Your HOA is trespassing. You've built a runway through my farmland. That's private property." He leaned back unbothered, folding his hands behind his head. "Technically, it's for the greater good of the community. We needed an airstrip for our private plane owners, and your land was the most convenient option." "Convenient?" I snapped. "It's theft. You had no authority." He shrugged. "We voted on it. That's how HOAs work. Majority rules." I stared at him in shock, trying to process the audacity. It was one thing to argue over lawn heights or mailbox colors. It was another to pave an unauthorized runway across someone else's farm. "That's not how property law works," I said sharply. Carl's smirk widened. "Well, you can take it up in court if you like. But good luck. We have a powerful legal team, and you're just a farmer." That last line hit me like a stone. Just a farmer. He had no idea who I was. No idea that the person he dismissed so arrogantly had direct oversight over every aviation, highway, and transportation project in the country. He had no clue that I was the very authority who regulated airstrips like the one he had illegally constructed. I said nothing, merely smiled faintly, and left. Let him enjoy his smugness. For now. The next week, things escalated. Planes began landing on the strip, small private aircraft that HOA residents apparently owned. They roared overhead as I tried to work, rattling the windows of my farmhouse and spooking my livestock. Cows scattered in panic, chickens flapped wildly, and my horses bolted at the thunderous noise. Each landing destroyed more of my crops, scattering debris and dust into the air. I tried reasoning again, meeting with the HOA board. They brushed me off, insisting the runway was an improvement to the neighborhood and would increase property values. My protests fell on deaf ears. To them, I was just one stubborn farmer standing in the way of their vision. They didn't realize they were trespassing not only on my land, but also on federal aviation law. I had kept quiet long enough. The following Monday, I returned to Washington. The Department of Transportation's headquarters stood tall and imposing, a far cry from the tranquility of my farm. I walked into my office, greeted by my staff with their usual efficiency. No one there knew about my personal land dispute, at least not yet. But they soon would. Janet, I called to my chief of staff. I need all regulations pertaining to private airstrips, zoning violations, and unauthorized construction. She blinked. Is this related to a new policy initiative? In a way, I said with a thin smile. By the end of the day, I had a mountain of documents, legal codes, and regulatory tools at my disposal. I didn't just plan to fight the HOA. I planned to bury them under the weight of the very federal system they had chosen to ignore. The first strike came in the form of a formal notice from the FAA. The letter, drafted under my supervision, informed the HOA that their runway violated multiple federal regulations, including safety standards, environmental assessments, and zoning laws. Failure to cease operations would result in severe penalties and possible criminal charges. Carl Benson called me that evening, his voice trembling with anger. You had something to do with this, didn't you? I kept my tone neutral. I don't know what you're talking about, but it looks like you've built an illegal airstrip. You think you can scare us with paperwork? We're not backing down. I chuckled softly. Carl, you should really look up who I am before making threats. There was a pause on the line. What do you mean? I said calmly, that I'm the United States Secretary of Transportation, and you've just built an unauthorized runway on my farm. The silence that followed was delicious. The weeks that followed were nothing short of a nightmare for the HOA. Federal inspectors swarmed the site, measuring, photographing, and documenting every violation. They found dozens: environmental impact violations, unsafe construction practices, lack of permits, and even threats to nearby wildlife habitats. Then came the fines. Millions of dollars in penalties rained down on the HOA. Their budget, once bloated with membership fees, bled dry almost overnight. Residents who had been cheering for their private runway now turned on Carl and his board, furious that their HOA dues were being squandered to fight federal lawsuits. But I wasn't done. With a few phone calls, I arranged for the runway to be decommissioned. Federal agents oversaw the process, ripping up asphalt and dismantling lights, leaving behind nothing but a scarred patch of earth. The HOA tried appealing, but each attempt was crushed under the weight of the law. They had gambled against the Secretary of Transportation and lost spectacularly. When it was all over, Carl Benson stood on my property, defeated. His once pristine polo shirt was wrinkled, his smug expression replaced with exhaustion. You could have just told us who you were from the start, he muttered bitterly. I looked him square in the eye. I shouldn't have had to. Respecting property rights isn't about who someone is, it's about basic decency and the law. You forgot that. And now your entire community is paying the price. He had no reply. He simply turned and walked away, shoulders slumped. Peace eventually returned to my farm. The scars of the runway faded as I replanted crops, restoring life to the soil that had been stolen from me. The planes no longer roared overhead, and my animals settled back into their calm rhythms. I could finally breathe again, enjoying the simple joys that had drawn me here in the first place. But word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered, townsfolk gossiped, and soon the story of the arrogant HOA who built a runway on the Secretary of Transportation's land became local legend. People came to me for advice, farmers and homeowners alike, realizing that sometimes the fight against greed and entitlement requires standing firm, and having the right connections doesn't hurt either. As for me, I returned to Washington each week with a renewed sense of purpose. Policy wasn't just paperwork. It was personal. Every law, every regulation I upheld mattered, because behind each one was a farmer, a family, a community trying to live in peace. And I swore that as long as I held my office, no HOA or anyone else would ever again think they could steal someone's land for convenience. Not on my watch. I had always known that my homeowners association was a nest of busybodies, but never in my wildest imagination did I think they would be reckless enough to build a literal runway through my farm. Yes, you heard that right. A private airstrip, complete with painted lines, runway lights, and even a sign declaring HOA Community Airfield. At first glance, it might have seemed like some overzealous aviation enthusiast's pet project, but no, This was a collective effort, spearheaded by the very people who thought measuring the length of my grass and regulating the shade of paint on my barn was their divine right. What they didn't know, however, was that I wasn't just some farmer trying to make ends meet. I was also the United States Secretary of Transportation, and if there was anyone who could bring down the full weight of the federal government on their little project, it was me. It all started on a warm Saturday morning. I had just finished feeding the horses and was enjoying the quiet that only a rural property could offer. My farm stretched across 120 acres, a patchwork of fields, barns, and pastures that had been in my family for 3 generations. To me, it was more than land, it was legacy, roots, and sanctuary. But to the HOA, who technically governed the neighboring subdivision that bordered a corner of my farm, it was simply unused potential. They saw flat land and wide open skies, and instead of appreciating the beauty, they thought of airplanes. The first sign of trouble was a series of strange survey markers that appeared near my property line. Orange flags stuck into the ground, bright paint lines across the dirt, things I recognized immediately as preparatory work for some kind of construction. I assumed it was just another HOA stunt, maybe a new sidewalk or an extension of their manicured walking trails. But then the heavy equipment came. Bulldozers rolled in on a Wednesday morning, engines roaring, tearing into the earth with terrifying precision. By noon, they had carved a straight strip through the corner of my north pasture, flattening the ground I used for grazing. I stormed over to confront the site manager, who happened to be none other than Greg Patterson, the HOA president and self-proclaimed visionary of the neighborhood. He stood there in a bright yellow safety vest, sunglasses perched on his nose, arms crossed like some kind of general surveying his conquest. "Greg, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, boots kicking up dirt as I marched toward him. "Morning, neighbor," he called back cheerfully, as though I hadn't just witnessed him destroying part of my land. "We're building something great for the community. You'll thank us later." "Building something great?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You bulldozed my pasture. That's private property. You can't just roll in here with your toys and tear it up." Greg smirked, and that smug grin of his made my blood boil. "Relax. It's for the greater good. We've been planning this for months." The HOA approved it unanimously. A private runway, just imagine the property values. Imagine the convenience. Planes will be able to land right here, bringing in business, prestige, maybe even tourists. You're standing on the future, my friend. I stared at him, stunned. The arrogance was almost impressive. "Greg, you can't build a runway through my farm. This isn't a cul-de-sac with a new stop sign. This is federal aviation territory. You're messing with laws you don't even begin to understand." That's when his grin widened, and he leaned in like he was letting me in on a secret. "Oh, but we do understand. We looked it up. Community airstrips are totally legal. And since part of your farm technically falls under HOA jurisdiction due to that old land covenant, well, you're part of the project whether you like it or not." I froze. The covenant. I had almost forgotten. Decades ago, my grandfather had signed an agreement that gave the neighboring subdivisions association some limited authority over a corner of the property, mainly concerning shared easements and access roads. It was supposed to be a minor, harmless arrangement. But now Greg was using it as a weapon. "You're out of your mind," I said coldly. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Greg chuckled. "A cranky farmer who doesn't like progress?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm raging inside me. "No, Greg. You're dealing with the United States Secretary of Transportation. And if you think for a second that I'm going to let you build an illegal runway on my farm, you're about to learn what real federal oversight looks like." For the first time that morning, Greg's confident smirk faltered. Just a flicker, but enough for me to see the doubt creeping in. Still, he puffed out his chest and said, "We'll see about that." I had always known that my homeowners association was a collection of meddlers with too much free time, but never in my wildest imagination did I think they would be reckless enough to build a literal runway through my farm. Yes, you heard that right. A private airstrip, complete with painted lines, solar-powered lights, and even a sign declaring, HOA Community Airfield. At first glance, it might have seemed like some overzealous aviation enthusiast's pipe dream, but no, this was a collective effort, spearheaded by the very people who once fined me for painting my barn a shade too rustic. What they didn't know, however, was that I wasn't just some farmer trying to protect his land. I was also the United States Secretary of Transportation, and if there was anyone in the country who could bring down the full weight of federal law on their ridiculous project, it was me. It all started on a warm Saturday morning in late spring. I had just finished feeding the horses and was leaning against the fence, sipping coffee, and enjoying the quiet that only a farm at sunrise could provide. My land stretched across 120 acres, a patchwork of wheat fields, pastures, and groves that had been in my family for 3 generations. To me, it wasn't just property, it was legacy, blood, sweat, and the stories of everyone who had worked the soil before me. To the HOA, however, who governed the neighboring subdivision that bordered the north corner of my farm, it was simply unused potential. They looked at the wide-open fields and flat land and saw dollar signs and possibilities. The first signs of trouble came in the form of strange survey flags that appeared near the property line. Bright orange and neon pink plastic squares fluttered in the breeze, stuck into the soil like intrusive weeds. At first, I assumed it was just another HOA landscaping project, maybe an extension of their walking trails or a bike path to appease the joggers who love to trespass. But then, a week later, the heavy machinery arrived. Bulldozers roared early one Wednesday morning, their engines shaking the ground. By noon, they had carved out a straight path across the edge of my north pasture. Furious, I stormed across the field to confront whoever was in charge. Of course, it was none other than Greg Patterson, the HOA president. Greg was a short, self-important man with mirrored sunglasses, a permanent smirk, and the unshakable belief that everything he touched turned into a community improvement. He stood there in a neon safety vest, holding a clipboard like he was directing the construction of a new interstate instead of trespassing on private farmland. "Greg, what the hell are you doing?" I barked, boots stomping through the churned soil. "Morning, neighbor," he called cheerfully, as though I hadn't just watched him bulldoze a quarter acre of my pasture. "We're building something great for the community. You'll thank us later." "Building something great?" I echoed, my voice rising. "You've destroyed my property. This is private land. You can't just come in here with your machines and start ripping it apart." Greg smirked, that infuriating little grin of his widening. "Relax. It's for the greater good. We've been planning this for months." The HOA approved it unanimously. A private runway, just imagine it. Property values will skyrocket, families will have access to convenient air travel, and our neighborhood will become the envy of the entire state. Planes landing right here, bringing in business, prestige, maybe even celebrities. You're standing on the future, my friend. I stared at him in disbelief. A runway? On my farm? The arrogance was almost breathtaking. "Greg, you can't build a runway here. This isn't some cul-de-sac with a speed bump. This is federal aviation territory. You're messing with laws you don't even begin to understand." His smirk never faded. "Oh, but we do understand. We did our research. Community airstrips are legal. And since part of your land technically falls under HOA jurisdiction thanks to that old covenant, you're part of the project whether you like it or not." My stomach sank. The covenant. I had almost forgotten. Decades ago, my grandfather signed a minor agreement allowing the subdivision shared access to a strip of road for emergency vehicles. It was never supposed to extend beyond that. But Greg had twisted it into a weapon, claiming jurisdiction over a larger piece of land than intended. "You're insane," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Greg chuckled. "A cranky farmer who doesn't like progress?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "No, Greg. You're dealing with the United States Secretary of Transportation. And if you think for a second I'm going to let you build an illegal airstrip on my farm, you're about to learn what real federal oversight looks like." For the first time that morning, Greg's smile faltered. It was just a flicker, but enough for me to notice. Still, his arrogance was too deeply rooted to back down completely. He puffed out his chest and said, "We'll see about that." That night, I sat in my study, staring at the maps and documents I had pulled from my files. I had access to more aviation regulations and federal enforcement tools than Greg could even imagine. The Federal Aviation Administration, environmental impact assessments, zoning laws, each one was a hammer I could drop on their heads. But part of me hesitated. I wasn't just a government official, I was also a farmer, and this was my community. I didn't want to destroy my neighbors with red tape if I didn't have to. What I wanted was for them to see reason. Unfortunately, reason was not something Greg Patterson or his HOA board possessed. 2 days later, I returned to the site. The runway had grown longer. Fresh gravel had been laid, and they were already setting up posts for lights. A small crowd of HOA members stood nearby, clapping and cheering like they were christening a new park. I marched straight up to Greg, who was giving some ridiculous speech about a new era of suburban aviation. "Greg," I interrupted, my voice cutting through the chatter. "This is your final warning. Stop construction now, or I will bring the full authority of the Department of Transportation and the FAA down on you. Do you understand?" The crowd fell silent. Greg's face reddened, but he forced a laugh. "Empty threats. You don't scare me. The HOA has rights." I looked him dead in the eye. "So, does the United S." I heard the bulldozers before I saw them, which was always an insult on a farm where the loudest regular noises were the lowing of cattle and the wind through the corn. The sound rolled over the hedgerow and into my kitchen window, and I set my mug down with the kind of slow, cold calm that comes right before a person does something irrevocable. By the time I reached the north fence, I could see the strip they'd already carved, a clean, arrogant line of compacted soil and fresh gravel that sliced through 3 acres of my oldest pasture, the place where my grandfather had taught me to brace a plow. Neighbors craned their necks from behind their mailboxes, and the HOA president, Greg Patterson, stood like a man at the center of a miracle he'd imagined, clipboard balanced against his hip, smile pasted on so tight it might come free at any moment. "Community airfield," someone shouted. "Property values," Greg added, as if that excused the steamroller. I walked the length of what they'd taken with measured steps. The runway wasn't long enough for a small jet yet. It didn't need to be. It only needed to be a statement, and that, more than the gravel or the painted centerline, was the real theft. I thought about my options: call the county, call the sheriff, call the lawyers. But the single law I carried around in my head like a private secret was heavier than any of those. I was the United States Secretary of Transportation. That truth could have scuttled the whole operation overnight with a single line from the right office, but I didn't want to crush people for the fun of it. I wanted them to see what they were doing and stop. I wanted a neighborly conversation to have weight again. I wanted to be a man who used power to calm, not to punish. So I walked straight up to Greg, smelled like hay and anger, and told him in plain country words to stop before his dream became other people's problem. He laughed, the kind of laugh that meant he'd already decided not to listen, and the machines kept chewing out the land. Night was thin and long the week that followed. I sat in my study sifting through files, zoning maps dog-eared where my assistant had highlighted passages, FAA guidance manuals bookmarked like prayers, and an old land covenant signed by my grandfather nearly 50 years ago. The covenant granted an easement of ingress and egress for emergency access to a small strip of the property. It did not license the erection of a landing strip. I could have taken out a stack of federal instruments and closed them like a trap, a letter to the FAA citing unpermitted construction in a protected rural area, an environmental review that would have stopped work pending months of study, a safety notice to the HOA that flights without appropriate aeronautical study would violate federal regulations. I could have made Greg bleed through paperwork until his petty dream collapsed. Instead, I wrote him a letter I hoped would be softer than paper could be, an invitation to meet me at the farm the next morning. I signed it with my name and my office and left off, deliberately, the title, so he would know but not feel ambushed. The board accepted the invitation with huffing curiosity, like dogs sniffing out an unfamiliar scent, and on the dew-bright morning of the meeting half the subdivision came down with folding chairs and curiosity, and the other half peered through curtains. We stood where the runway had begun, and spoke about community and about land stewardship and, I thought, about decency. Greg spoke about opportunity and vision, and how he'd talked to some pilot who promised to give free lessons to the kids. "You're romanticizing a farmer," he said to me at one point, as if farming were a nostalgic affectation. I told him farming was my family, and that the stench of money had a way of turning men into saints of convenience. A few of the neighbors shifted uncomfortably, but Greg's inner circle applauded like a man at the end of a convincing sermon. When words didn't move the board, we tried mediation. The mediator was a pleasant woman who wore sensible shoes and brought a stack of colored tabs. She spoke in a voice that made compromise sound like an act of bravery. On the third meeting, a young neighbor asked why we couldn't have both. a community landing area, and a thriving farm. Someone in the crowd suggested they could move the runway to a corner of the subdivision, closer to homes, and that the owners would love the novelty. A man with a baby stroller clapped slowly. The practicalities of noise abetted some support, but the HOA had momentum, and momentum is a strange kind of animal. Once it starts, it eats logic for breakfast. I offered to help fund sound barriers and to build a schedule that limited flights to weekend daylight hours. I proposed a community fund for maintenance so that no one expected the farm to subsidize the operation. Greg declined those concessions as if they were slights, and I began to see that this wasn't about aviation for him so much as legacy, an addition to his name in the minds of the neighborhood's homeowners who liked to believe that their ideas could change the skyline. The mediator suggested a temporary cease and desist, while we sought counsel on the covenant scope. Greg nodded, then winked at his group, and allowed inspection only if it suited him. The tractor started again 2 days later. There was a moment, about a week after the tractors returned, when the story started to bleed beyond the county line. A local paper's reporter came by, a wiry woman with ink under her fingernails who fancied herself a champion of the small man. She asked pointed questions about due process and about who had signed the permits. It turned out the HOA board had filed paperwork with the county under the guise of an agricultural access road and relied on loose terminology to justify construction without a comprehensive public hearing. Headlines are instruments. They can be made to play the tune of justice or to hum with the sound of scandal. I didn't want a scandal. I wanted a solution. Still, the coverage did what coverage does. It made people watch. Pilots from small clubs stopped by with their curiosity and with questions about why private citizens had started something that required municipal oversight. A lawyer for a local environmental group called and asked for maps. Greg began to get texts he pretended to ignore, and at night when the blinds were down and the dogs slept, I imagined him scrolling through his phone with the same taste of sour triumph he used when he caught a sparrow on the porch cat. The more people watched, the more fragile his ironclad confidence became. He doubled down and invited a vintage plane museum to consider landing exhibitions, which made the newspaper's arts editor call it ambition meeting audacity. The board held a celebratory barbecue, and my mailbox filled with letters, angry notes, support from pilots, petitions signed by people who thought the runway would make their lives easier, and a few that were simply rude. I tried one last appeal to reason before laws had to be raised like fences. I walked the boundary lines with the HOA board and their attorney, pointing out wetlands that were under state protection, the migratory bird patterns that made that strip of land a no-go for flights during nesting season, the underground aquifer lines that could be imperiled if runoff wasn't handled correctly. I talked about liability, about the thin mysteries of insurance policies, and about how an airplane landing in a residential area, even a small one, was an invitation for catastrophe. The attorney, a man who wore bespoke suits and smelled faintly of mint, acknowledged each point and said, "That will make it more complicated." Complication, in legal parlance, is a polite synonym for delay. Greg shook my hand and put his arm around me in a gesture he intended to be conciliatory, but that read to me like a manual on how to belittle an opponent. When the attorney left, he sent me a note, short, practical. "If you're willing to negotiate a transfer of use that benefits the HOA, we can explore options." The offer smelled of bartering with a ledger. I thought of my grandfather's signature on the covenant and the way property had been passed down with care and reluctance, and I wondered how many times in history small men had cashed in small opportunities and called it progress. So I filed. I couldn't avoid it. There was no halfway between advocacy and enforcement when people were trampling your land and your patience. I filed the appropriate notices with the FAA and the county, requested an immediate halt to construction pending review, and demanded an emergency environmental assessment. The legal wheels creaked into motion. I sent letters to the HOA board inviting them to withdraw their permits voluntarily and to enter a mediated plan that would keep both community benefits and my farm intact. Some of them responded with fury, others with a kind of stunned disbelief that the federal apparatus could touch their neighborhood barbecues. Laws are strange powers in practice. They look noble on paper, but are built from temper and draftsmanship and the persistence of those who insist on their meaning. The county scheduled a hearing, and the HOA prepared their files like a crucible. In the meantime, flights had not yet begun. There were too many holes in their plan, but the runway was a scar that would take years to heal. The hearing room smelled like coffee and wet coats and resolve. People from the subdivision sat beside farmers from neighboring properties, pilots with a yen for convenience, reporters with notepads, and a field ecologist who handed over a sheaf of data about species disturbance. Greg and his board presented a vision dotted with charts and financial forecasts and a slideshow that painted happy children waving at planes. He spoke about community sovereignty and the right of associations to enhance their property. I listened, then stood up to speak last. There is a gravity to the voice of the Secretary of Transportation that has nothing to do with ego and everything to do with duty. When I spoke, I chose to frame my authority not as a weapon but as a responsibility. I talked about infrastructure as stewardship, about what it meant to balance human convenience with environmental preservation. I spoke about how federal oversight existed to ensure local dreams didn't become public dangers. That speech never had the harsh bite of an affidavit, but public sentiment wrapped around the words like a tide. When the county judge, an efficient woman with an even haircut, rendered her decision, she ordered a temporary injunction on the runway pending a full environmental impact statement and mandated that the HOA pay for part of the study. It was, in legal terms, a pause that felt like a victory. Victory, I learned, is a complex thing. The injunction bought time and forced the HOA to slow its engines, but it also deepened resentments. Some neighbors branded me a bureaucrat who'd ruin their fun. Others thanked me quietly while avoiding being seen with me on the street. Greg, true to form, declared the ruling a temporary setback and began a campaign of petty retaliation. Complaints filed at the town office about an unauthorized fence, anonymous leaflets about wasteful government, a social media group that circulated insinuations about my motives. It stung, not because the lies were convincing, most were not, but because the ugliness of neighborly contumely is a different kind of cost than any legal fine. I answered not with reprisals but with invitations. I opened the farm for an educational day, where kids could learn about air safety and about the real work behind landing and takeoff. I hired local contractors to build bird-friendly hedgerows and started a fund to preserve marginal acres as wildlife corridors. The gesture was partly calculated and partly true. I wanted to show that a responsible person could blend progress with protection. Some people came, some stayed away. Pilots who had advocated for the runway were surprisingly amenable to a program that offered lessons in controlled environments at local municipal airports. They valued community too. The seasons turned. The environmental assessment took months, then a year. The science confirmed what I'd suspected: sensitive habitats, water flow concerns, and a pattern of avian migration that made full-time operation of a runway there untenable without extensive mitigation that would have cost far more than the HOA had imagined. The report suggested alternative uses for the cleared land, community gardens, an observation meadow, a passive recreation area with strict noise protocols, and recommended that any aeronautical activities be limited to sanctioned events with prior coordination with the FAA. Faced with the data and the mounting costs, the HOA's board slowly, awkwardly, began to back away from its most extreme plans. Greg resigned his presidency with a speech about vision and learning, and, in private, I think he felt what everyone who fights for vanity feels when the world says no: embarrassed, diminished, yet relieved. The board voted to remove the runway materials, rehabilitate the soil, and plant a strip of native pollinators that, within a single summer, became a ribbon of color where tires had once crushed clovers. They funded a scholarship for a local student to study aviation at the community college, an olive branch that tasted, to me, like a start. When the last dump truck hauled away gravel and the painted centerline faded under new grass, the farm felt like itself again, but also like something new had been learned. I kept my title at the department in my pocket, but stopped letting it be the only thing I wore. People stopped by with casseroles or apologies, some sincere, others awkward, with jokes about the time the secretary tried to save their property values. We rebuilt what had been battered: hedgerows, fences, a greenway that welcomed joggers and kept them off the vulnerable field edges. The HOA instituted new rules about major projects requiring public hearings and independent environmental review. Greg moved to a different state a few months later. On his last day, a teenage volunteer painted a plaque down by the meadow that read, simply, "For the birds." I read it one morning with a cup of coffee and felt the gravity of small victories: a family's orchard saved, a wetland protected, a community nudged toward better choices. Power had its temptations, its easy paths to demonstrate force, but that day I felt thankful for the longer route we'd taken, one that made a scar into a garden. Years after the tractors had left and the runway was a story parents told their kids about how a neighborhood nearly built a thing that didn't belong, planes still came to the county airport. Kids from the subdivision who wanted to learn took lessons there, under the supervision of certified instructors. The scholarship fund churned out a mechanized, cautious stream of new pilots who respected charts and stewardship alike. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, I would walk the restored edge of the farm, the grass cool and the pollinators busy at work, and listen for the soft hum of a distant plane. It sounded different now, gentle, distant, appropriate. I'd think of Greg occasionally and not always unkindly. There are people who build things and people who protect what's already there, and the world needs both, if only they could meet in the middle more often. I'd also think of my grandfather and the stubborn way he kept the first seeds alive through drought years, and I'd tell the passing neighbor that stewardship was boring most of the time and heroic in the ways that don't make headlines. The farm, finally healed enough to forget the moment it was nearly taken, held its stories close. And in that soft, unremarkable piece, I found a lesson that felt more like inheritance than victory. Authority is not finished when the gavel falls, and the truest measure of power is what it protects when no one is watching. Had always known that the homeowners association running the subdivision next to my farm was a nest of meddlers, but never in my wildest imagination did I think they would one day bulldoze a strip of my land and try to turn it into a runway. Yes, a literal runway, complete with painted center lines, gravel foundation, and solar-powered lights. It looked like something out of a model airplane enthusiast dream, except this was full-sized and cut straight through the north pasture of a farm that had been in my family for 3 generations. To the HOA, it was progress. To me, it was vandalism. What they didn't know, however, was that I wasn't just some farmer with calloused hands and a stubborn streak. I also happened to be the United States Secretary of Transportation. That meant when it came to aviation, federal regulations, and infrastructure, I was the final word. If anyone could crush their little vanity project, it was me. The first signs of trouble were easy to miss. One Saturday morning, while feeding the horses, I noticed bright orange flags in the soil near the property line. At first, I thought the county was running a survey for utilities. A week later, spray-painted lines began to appear across the ground, and within days, heavy machinery was parked along the road. By the following Wednesday, bulldozers were at work, engines rumbling, carving a path that split my pasture like an ugly scar. My cattle scattered, dust rolled across the wheat, and a quarter-acre of grass I had tended since I was a boy was churned into rubble. I stormed toward the commotion, ready to rip into whoever was in charge. And of course, it was none other than Greg Patterson, the HOA president, strutting around in a neon vest, clipboard under his arm, acting like he was overseeing the construction of an international airport instead of trespassing on my farm. Greg was the kind of man who thought rules were for other people. He was short, smug, and had a permanent grin that reminded me of a used car salesman who had just tricked you into buying a lemon. "Greg," I shouted, marching through the dust. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" He turned, smiling like I'd just shown up to congratulate him. "Morning, neighbor. We're making progress. Big things ahead for the community. You'll thank me later." "Progress," I snapped, pointing to the flattened earth. "You bulldozed my pasture. This is private property. You can't just roll in here with your toys and tear it apart." Greg's grin widened. "Relax. This is for the greater good. The board approved it unanimously. We're building a community runway. Just imagine it, planes landing right here, bringing in business, prestige, and property value. Think about the convenience. This place will be the envy of the entire county." I stared at him, hardly able to process the arrogance spilling out of his mouth. "A runway? Here? Greg, this isn't a cul-de-sac project. This is federal aviation territory. You're messing with laws you can't even begin to understand." He smirked like he had just checkmated me. "Oh, but we do understand. We looked it up. Community airstrips are totally legal. And since part of your farm technically falls under HOA jurisdiction thanks to that old covenant your grandfather signed, you're part of the project whether you like it or not." My stomach tightened. The covenant. I'd almost forgotten about it. Decades ago, my grandfather signed an agreement that gave the subdivision access to a small strip of road for emergencies. It was meant to be harmless. Now Greg was twisting it into a weapon, claiming it gave the HOA jurisdiction over a larger chunk of my land. You're insane, I said through gritted teeth. Do you even realize who you're dealing with? Greg chuckled. A cranky farmer who doesn't like change? I stepped closer, lowering my voice until he had to lean in to hear me. No, Greg. You're dealing with the United States Secretary of Transportation. And if you think I'm going to let you build an illegal runway on my farm, you're about to learn what federal oversight really looks like. For the first time, his smile flickered. Just for a second. But then he puffed out his chest and waved me off. We'll see about that. That night I sat in my study, maps and documents spread out before me. I could have shut the project down with a single phone call. The FAA, the Department of Transportation, even Homeland Security would have been all over this unauthorized strip of asphalt in the making. But part of me hesitated. I wasn't just a bureaucrat. I was also a neighbor, and I didn't want to bury people I'd lived beside for years under mountains of red tape if I didn't have to. What I wanted was for them to see reason. Unfortunately, reason was not a language Greg Patterson spoke. By the end of the week, the runway was already longer. Fresh gravel lined the path, and workers had begun setting up posts for lighting. A crowd of HOA members gathered, clapping like they were watching history being made. Greg stood on a makeshift podium, giving a speech about ushering in a new era of suburban aviation. That was when I decided enough was enough. Greg, I shouted over the applause as I walked up to him. This is your final warning. Stop construction now, or I will bring the full weight of the Department of Transportation and the FAA down on you. Do you understand? The crowd fell silent. Greg's face turned red, but he forced a laugh. Empty threats. You don't scare me. The HOA has rights. I locked eyes with him. So does the United States government. And unlike you, I know exactly how to enforce them.